16 or so months after my husband had died, I'd had grief counselling. I thought I was doing quite well at having processed what had happened. But on Mother's Day weekend, which was a weekend where Pete would have, you know, we would have had breakfast in bed, or there'd have been something, he'd have planned a nice walk and lunch out maybe, and it was a day where I was made to feel really special, right? And he made sure the kids really appreciated me. So on that particular weekend, it was the Saturday, I could literally not get out of bed. It was like I had been poured into liquid concrete and my mattress was concrete and I literally couldn't move. The kids were coming in and they were speaking to me, and I could see their mouths moving, but the words that they were saying just weren't going in. So my eldest called my best friend and eventually my mum, and it was called a paralysis breakdown. I didn't know it at the time. But what had ultimately happened was that my unprocessed grief had come to bite me on the bum big time. And that was a key moment for me. That's like, yeah, even though I knew that processing it would be important, the grief counselling that I'd had hadn't really done that. So that was the first thing. And then the second thing was more of a sort of creeping whisper that I kept hearing in my head that you're here to do grief work now, you're here to do grief work now. And what we often do with those voices is we ignore them, don't we? Because
One of the first books I read when my dad died, right, was Grief Observed by C.S. Lewis, right? And then and I give it if my friends are reading this who have lost a loved one, I have sent this book to all of them at the point where, because it's one of the books that I felt like, was very, very raw in its approach to grief. Right. And then C.S. Lewis said something. He said, the death of a beloved is an amputation. Right. And when I hear that, I think of how, you know, it's essentially that when we think of healing, right, generally in medical terms, you're like, if you've got a cut or if something happens, you're trying to get back to who you were, right? But for grief, it's like, boom, you're never going back to, what you were. Like if it's an amputation, it means that piece is essentially missing, right? And then I'm just curious as to how then do we it's not recovery, I don't even know the right word, right? How do you deal with that missing piece? Like it's been cut off, right? But the thing about amputation is, there's a phantom to it. Like there's a feeling that it's supposed to be there. Like if you speak to anybody who's ever been amputated, it's like it's supposed to be there, but it's no longer there. So it's essentially not even missing, because missing means it can be found or there's a possibility of it being found. So how do you like deal with that?
Yeah, and that's a really tricky one. And that's again, so there's a difference there between what your conscious mind is aware of and what your subconscious mind knows. There's two different things going on there, right? So there's another example in another great book, oh, the name of which completely escapes me, where they talk about, when you go down for a glass of water in the middle of the night, and say, for example, you always bump your thigh on the dining room table. And so what you start to do is you start to take a different route because it's dark, but because you're so familiar with your own house, and you do this every night, you go down in the dark, you kind of shift out of the way a bit so you don't bump yourself on the dining table, and on you go. And then they liken it to the fact that actually that dining table all of a sudden gets taken away. But yet subconsciously, you'll still take the same route to get your glass of water because you're still expecting to bump your leg on the dining room table. And that's exactly what you've just referred to. It's the subconscious brain seeks pattern, familiarity, recognition. And so it takes a long time to catch up with what the conscious brain knows, which is they're no longer here. That arm no longer exists. That dining table is no longer there. And that takes time. Now, I don't believe that time on its own, does not help grief. You wouldn't say that to someone that's broken their leg or had, you wouldn't say that to an amputee. Time will heal. Time alone does not, unless you deal with it and process it and have, x-rays, or you have physiotherapy, or you have all the things that you would do if it was a physical thing, like you say, with having this amputation. The fact that it's an emotional amputation, again, it's very different. And to me, yeah, and it's back to those opposites, isn't it? You know, your rational brain knows you're not going to see that person again. You know that your arm ought to be there, but it's not, and it's wrapping your head around that. And like you say, when the amputees have this phantom, they can still believe and feel that they can feel their limbs still present. That's what it's. For ages, I still expected my husband to walk through the front door at 5:45, and my body was waiting, and it still had that anticipation, because subconsciously that was the pattern that had happened for so long. And so it takes a long time for our subconscious to catch up with what our conscious brain knows. And that's hard.
Yeah, I think it's very, very hard. And it's funny that you mentioned the book, right? Because I have it on my notes, right? That particular excerpt, right? Because it's by Mary Frances O'Connor,
Yes.
the Grieving Brain. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And for people who are listening, I'm just gonna read out that part because I feel it's very, very, very important. Imagine waking up thirsty in the middle of the night. You get out of bed and head to the kitchen to get a glass of water. Down the hall, you cross the dark dining room toward the kitchen. At the moment that your hip should bump into the hard corner of the dining room table, what is it you feel? Nothing. You're suddenly aware that you don't feel anything in that spot at the height of your hip. This is what you're aware of, not feeling something specific. The absence of something is what has drawn your attention. How can nothing draw our attention? No one expects the dining room table to get stolen, and no one expects a loved one to die.
Exactly. It's a really powerful analogy, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is, and I think what I struggle with personally is basically how it changes us as a person. Like for example, you spoke about um you know the paralysis, for example, that you
Mm.
felt, right 18 or 16 months after Pete left, right? It's like, how does it change our mind? How does grief change our body, right? Because those are two different things, if we're being honest, right? And then it's yeah, from your own experience, how does grief change that?
I think I've experienced a number of different things. So and this isn't in relation to my husband's death, it was in relation to baby loss and a miscarriage that I had many, many years ago. Again, hadn't processed it, because we just carry on with these things, don't we? But, and this was so fascinating to me when the penny finally dropped, what was going on. So the miscarriage happened in October, and it was quite traumatic. It was in a foreign country, and it was all quite, yeah. Um, and that was October. And from that year on, every single year in October, one of my eyes would fill with goo and be itchy and just really irritated. And it would last for maybe 3 months into the new year. And it was years and years later, and it had come to October. I was in the bathroom, I was scratching my eye out, and it was my husband Pete that was like, "Lou, how long have you had this?" And it just came from my subconscious, and it was like, "Since a miscarriage." And I was like, "Oh my god, the body keeps the score." Every October, I had this trauma sort of, come back. You say that you don't recall the date your dad died, but I bet your body does. I bet something will feel off or not quite right, or you might get ill or poorly or a little bit sick around that time, because your body will know. And you may have buried that deep within your subconscious, but your subconscious still knows that date. And so that whole thing with the eye, that happened for, how long did that happen for? Like 12 years. 12 years on a yearly basis. And that was with, another significant loss. But and I think it very much depends person to person, how sort of how we are, and how, and having spoken to a number of grieving people and worked with them, it can manifest itself physically in different ways.
I was listening to like Whoopi Goldberg, and she was talking about the loss of her mom and her brother, and then she said, "No one who hasn't lost this way can understand." Right.
Mm.
And I think it's something that is a bit, can be extended to generally to grief itself, right? And I wonder if if that is something you can expand on. The idea that grief, loss, death can both be like a universal experience, but also be some sort of a unique experience. Right. Also, it could be something you also disagree with. I'm just curious. And also this would be a good segue to also, maybe talk a bit about, the article you said you just published. Because again, you spoke about having somebody, if possible, sit with you in the grief. But the problem is a lot of people don't know how to talk about it. And it goes back to what Whoopi Goldberg said. If I'm going through grief, I'm also of the opinion that no one who hasn't experienced this can fully understand. And even if they have, it's like you cannot understand it in the way that I am going through it. So it's like if I'm sitting with somebody going through grief, like how do I sit with them? Like, how do I help them? Like, what are some of the things to, to not say or just generally? Yeah, I'm just really, I feel like I've loaded a couple of questions in that, but yeah.
Mhm. Well, let's tackle that one first, then we'll go back to the individuality of grief. Um, Often it's not saying anything at all. It's like my best friend has been my rock for the last 3 years, and sometimes and she hasn't lost her husband, so she doesn't know what it's like. She has been able to hold space for me in a way like where she's just come round. She's known I've been having a difficult day, and she's just popped round to sit with me, not to say anything, just to be with me while I talk or cry, or we just sit in silence and have a cup of tea. There's often an expectation that I need to know the right thing to say, I need to know how to help. And yes, there are definitely things to say, to not say, to a grieving person, especially in the immediate sort of aftermath of that loss. Sometimes it's just having someone to pop round and make you a coffee with no expectation whatsoever. And she has been able to, my best friend has been able to do that without trying to fix it or fix me, because it's not something that we fix. Um, Things to say and not say. I always say to people, say something rather than nothing, because saying nothing, like I've had school mums that I've known for years cross the playground to avoid me when it happened. And that, grief is really isolating, isn't it? It's a lonely place that you're navigating. To have that happen feels, you just, it's like they don't know what to say to me because this tragedy's just happened, but I would rather you come up to me and say I'm sorry for your loss than completely ignore me and cross over the playground to avoid me. So I always say something rather than nothing, even if the something feels a bit clunky. And and I think, and again, we can say, I don't know what to say to you right now. And I always say that is a really actually a good thing to say, because of course we don't. Of course, it's really hard to articulate your feelings. So I would say, I really don't know what to say to you right now, but I'm so incredibly sorry. One of the key moments I remember very, very in the days after my husband had died was that an old school friend of mine was home for Christmas, because it, it happened around Christmas time. He drove all the way up from London to Leeds, where I live, to just come and be with me. And as he walked in the door, he said, "Lou, I've been racking my brains all the way up the M1 trying to think of what to say to you, and I've got nothing." And he just gave me the big hug. And that has stayed with me, because his honesty in that moment, that he'd literally spent a 3-hour drive trying to think of what to say, and then ultimately was like, I got nothing. I just want to be here with you because this is awful. Um, that was one of the things that meant and that's a really lasting memory for me, because his honesty and vulnerability in that moment of, I don't know what to say, but he didn't avoid it. He drove 3.5 hours to come and be with me, and then drove all the way home again in a day. And that meant the absolute world, because he took action and he did something. I think I think there's something to be said for also, and I think it depends on the circumstances, doesn't it, of that situation, the room you happen to find yourself in, the circumstances around it. There's a lot to be said for asking permission of the grieving person. Like, how do you feel today? Do you want to talk about it? Do you want to just pretend that everything's okay and just crack on today, or give me a nod when you're ready to leave, and I'll leave with you. I think it's just it's facing it. It's like, where are you at today? If you want to come and join us in this room and just be the old version of you for a couple of hours, and then just give me the nod when you've had enough, because those kind of things can feel quite overwhelming, especially the first times going to events, being in rooms with people. There's the phrase, isn't there? You can feel lonely in a room surrounded by a room full of people. And it's checking in with that person, checking in, just like, let me know if you're not okay. We can go. That's fine. And just sort of asking permission and just keeping checking in. Like, where are you at? You still all right? You good? Yeah.
I
And
think asking permission is not a very common advice, and it's something that I think makes sense. Now that you say it, it's like just ask them like, how do you feel today? Like, what would you rather us do today? Like, right? Do you just, right? Maybe I can come over and just sit with you, and we could play some card games if that's okay. Like whatever works for you. And I yeah, because usually also in our bid to help or to be there, we assume what's needed. Right,
yeah,
we step in. We're like, oh, they're gonna need like food. They're gonna need like maybe need keep my kids to come around to just lighten the mood, and maybe they want to sit in the sadness and the angst for a minute, and then you come and
yeah. And sometimes they might want a bit of a distraction. They might want a bit of a laugh and a joke to feel normal again for half an hour. And it's just kind of checking in, like, where are you at today? Because today is all that they can focus on. People say, how are you? That is such a big question to someone that is grieving, isn't it? Because it's like, I don't even know how I am. I don't know what day it is. I don't know whether I should be having breakfast or dinner. I literally don't know. How are you today? How are you this morning? Break it down into, make it smaller so it's easier for that person to kind of go, oh yeah, this morning I'm okay.
yeah. I'm gonna read out something I wrote about that. Like it's like you sort of get me in a way, right? Because here I remember this was something I wrote a while ago during this phase where, and I remember people were asking me, so how have you been, right? And I remember saying that it's a question of offered as an invite to share, but not really. The person asking is asking for a timeline you cannot quantify. So you say I've been good, but what does that mean? Good since when? Good compared to what? So the question floats in this strange space between genuine curiosity and a social ritual, close enough to caring that you can't ignore it, but vague enough that any real answer would feel like too much. So you deflect and you compress weeks into months of living into two words that mean nothing and everything, and both of you know it, both of you accept it. So eventually you say something like, you know what, I've been good, and like life hasn't been that bad. And it's something I always like. It's now that you verbalize, because I've written this for a long time, and I'm like, does this even make sense? Because it's something I struggle with. Like, whenever I deal with stuff, people just kind of, so how have you been? Like, but they don't say how have you been since the death of X or since this has happened.
Mm.
So they throw it out there.
It's unspoken, isn't it? It's unspoken. You know that that's what they mean, but they haven't said it and been really clear. So you just kind of use it as you can just gloss it. Yeah, I'm all right. Yeah, I'm good, thanks. I'm good. And it is. It's that silent spiral of, I know that you know what the intention is behind my question, but you know that I know that I don't really want to answer it. And so yeah, down we go. Down we go.
I have about two questions, and I know time has gone, but I think this is particular to one of the reasons why I reached out, right? Which is essentially dealing with like grief that shows up after a long time, right? You think you've, for lack of a better word, you think you've learned to live with it or deal with it, and then there's something that happens, or there's a life change, and then it just comes up in such a fresh way that demands you to stop and pay attention to it, right? What exactly is that, right? Like, because it feels very, for me, it felt very defeating, right? In terms of like, damn, it's been like 10 years or thereabout, like why does this all of a sudden feel so fresh again? Like, and I mean, you probably can hear it in my voice. It's something that it feels like I'm now living through what I lived through 10 years ago, and it doesn't make any sense, right? So I'll does somebody like what exactly is it? And then how do you just
I think it's probably a number of things. I think there's the fact that you are now a father and you are seeing your own dad through a different lens now that you didn't have the opportunity to see him as before because you didn't have that appreciation, right, of what it's like to be a father. And now you do. And I think there's that backwards looking lens of I wish I'd appreciated him, and now I know what I know. And I think there's also the grieving for a version of a future that doesn't exist. He doesn't get to be a granddad. You don't get to have conversations with him about when you were a kid. And did Eden, see what Eden's doing? Did I do that when I was one? Did I? And you're not getting the opportunity to share that, to share in that fatherhood, which would have been a bonding thing for the two of you. You're grieving the fact that you're grieving what you've lost. You're grieving what Eden hasn't got. He hasn't got a granddad. And you're grieving that your dad's missing out on all of this.
hmm. I think I think that's perfect. Because I find myself lately going to my mom and saying, Eden is doing XYZ. Did I do that? Right. I remember going to her and like, it's like one is trying to walk, but he's not working. And I was like, yeah, yeah, you didn't walk for a long time. Like, don't worry. Like, it's just, and I think one of the things that came up to me was that, especially in those moments, I'm like, damn, I wonder what parts of me is my dad that I do not know because I didn't get to, or I don't really know him as much. Because when he passed is around the period when you start to get to know your parents as a human being rather than just your parent. I do not have that. So it's like I'm having to go back to my mom. I'm going to have a conversation with my mom as well, like properly on a like podcast to actually talk to her about what my dad was like, right? And what parts of me or part of him is in me. And I think what you just shared makes a lot of sense because it's been like I didn't connect the dots that way in terms of oh yeah and yeah I mean so what I just have to now come into some sort of acceptance and relearn living through that.
Yeah, and like I said before, I'm not a fan of the word acceptance because I don't believe we have to accept it. I think acknowledgement, like I said, it's like, yeah, living with the acknowledgement of all those difficult feelings that we've just explored about your dad not being here anymore. And I think as well what you've just alluded to, the age you were when your dad died, you're not interested in your parents. They're the last thing you're interested in. They've got a whole other world of more exciting people, than your own parent. I know I've got a teenage son. Um, it's Yeah, and so I think there's almost probably a sense of regret as well that you maybe didn't get to know your dad. It's like you think, I would love to have had the opportunity to ask my granddad stories about the war, but he died when I was 6. So I didn't get the chance to do that, because it's only later in life, isn't it, that we appreciate those people for, oh, like you said, oh, they're an actual human being. There's more. They're a multifaceted person. They've got a history. They had a life before me. All of that is now no longer on the table. And I think that for my own children, they lost their dad when they were 6 and 8. And coming back to the Whoopi Goldberg question, actually, is grief universal? Yes and no. Again, it's the opposites. I lost the one person died, but I lost a husband. They lost a dad. I don't know what that's like to lose a dad, age 6. I do not. So that's a very different loss to my loss. And Pete's parents lost their son, age 40. Again, I don't know. I can't imagine what that's like. This, it's the same person that's died, but completely, completely different experiences of that. There's a son, there's a father, there's a husband, there's a friend, there's a colleague, there's, you know, a brother, there's all the other relationships as well. But that's when it's different. So how can I truly empathize with my children? I didn't lose my dad when I was 6 or 8 or 14, with the ages of my children, where when Pete died. I cannot possibly imagine what it's like to lose a child. We all expect to outlive, our children to outlive us. All I know with that one single person is what it's like to lose a husband. So yes, we're all grieving. And in that respect, grief is universal in as much as some of the feelings and the emotions that we feel, but we each experience it differently because our relationship with that person was unique.
I really, really, really love that. And last question here is you speak to a lot of people who, go through grief and a lot of, other life experiences. What do you wish more people would ask you about grief that most people don't?
That's a really great question. Think it I think it stems from people come to me and they want to fix it or solve it or feel better. They come to me and they say, Lou, I just want to feel better. I don't want to feel this sadness. I don't want to feel this. Instead of asking me, how can I integrate this grief? How can I? Because there's no fixing. There's no getting over it. We kind of, you've alluded to sort of this unspoken timeline that we think people should be over it by, whatever that is. I wish people didn't expect that, and I wish they would come and go, how can you help me become the version of me that exists now because of what's happened? Because when we've talked about it already, there's that identity shift, the before, the after, and if we allow ourselves to, we can become, we already are, a different version of the version we were before, but we can allow that to fuel, it's like, how can I use this to fuel something else? How can I harness all of these emotions to, I wonder what my kids will end up doing because of what happened to them at such a young age. And my daughter in particular, I say to her, use this pain, this anger that you feel, to do something with it. Like harness it. It's like she's like a little volcano full of lots of anger. But I know she's going to ultimately do something really good with that. And if we could just learn to go, okay, this has happened. Who am I now? How has this shaped me into being this new version of me? And how do I embody that new identity that is me now?